Good afternoon and welcome to today's live webinar session on Division 1 rules, Bylaw 12, 15, 16, COVID-19 Q&A. I will be the primary presenter today. Again, my name is Alex Smith. I'm Associate Director here in Academic and Membership Affairs. Steve Clare will be my co-presenter, but you will hear him generally monitoring and piping in whenever there are certain questions that have come in through the chat feature to help us with the back and forth there. A couple of things here as we get started. Again, my primary goal here today is to maybe highlight a few things that already exist in the Q&A. Also highlight, I think, some areas that we are currently reviewing that have been brought forward to our attention. As again, usually as we move into a new time period, things become more front and center at institutions. We'll get additional questions in those areas. And then we will pause after each bylaw and see if there are any questions that maybe I didn't get to, or are themes that you would want me to address in each of the areas that we're going to go through. For purposes of how we're breaking things down, I will highlight Bylaw 12, move to Bylaw 15, and then finish with Bylaw 16. That's just to give structure to our conversation today. But again, my primary goal is to try and hopefully hit on what is currently available, what are the things that we're working through, hopefully a sense of where those conversations are, how they are moving forward, and then also hopefully identify any areas that maybe we are not paying attention to currently that we potentially need to be. With that in mind, I will also want to give a thank you to all of you who have provided me with some questions prior to beginning this session today. We'll use some of those questions to, I think, start the conversation here as well. So let's start with the Bylaw 12 area for amateurism, and a couple of things that I want to make sure I'm highlighting in this area for you all. One is relative to just noting that the season of competition waiver section is really better handled. Any questions you have is really better handled working through our student athlete reinstatement staff, since the season of competition waiver falls within that area. I think they're doing a very good job of trying to track those types of questions in terms of how this would be self-applied in future years for student athletes, whether somebody needs a season of competition waiver versus a waiver of their for a 6th year, those types of things, and whether they can be self-applied or whether the normal waiver process would be available in that particular area. Another area that I do want to highlight from the Q&A currently is that there have been several new questions. I think there are 3 questions now relative to the NBA pre-draft. I think the most recent one that is either up hopefully we have one up now or it will be up later today, is in relation to what does the new withdrawal date mean relative to obligations, relative to renew or not renew aid. And again, I think it's just to remind folks that the status quo is in existence, and that the bylaws that are currently applicable for renewal, cancellation, reduction are all still in place in that particular area. The last major area that is currently, I think highlighted in the current Q&A that I want to touch on is really both in terms of, I think it arose originally in the COVID space and has been certainly now, I think, even more front and center in terms of some of the social action of our student athletes, and their willingness to want to better their communities, to better the world, and to engage in potentially fundraising opportunities in those particular areas. And while if it all fits within 12.511, it's a fairly easy analysis on your campus. I think we still understand that there may be situations where it doesn't neatly fit within that bylaw. And certainly the NCAA staff has seen several of those inquiries from that perspective, and we've worked with institutions to, I think, to really try and find a certain level of flexibility that I think adheres to, I think, ongoing conversations that we're having regarding name, image, and likeness, certainly not to try and be in the way of these types of social interactions and wanting to be helpful citizens in regards to these fundraisers. And so rarely, I think as a parameter basis, we want to ensure that the student athletes themselves are not necessarily making profit off of these, that these are truly fundraising activities. I think we want to ensure that these are, I think, in the world, especially when they involve potentially athletically related activities that are being conducted truly voluntary, that there doesn't appear to be an emphasis or a pushing by coaches for them to be engaging, that this is really their activities that they're wanting to be engaging in. And then to the extent that the institution is looking to promote these activities, I think to really look at it from the lens of from what would be an engaging, I think, across your campus, what would be the promotional activities that as an institution you would want to be doing for any of your students who are engaging in these, types of fundraisers, types of activities that I think are becoming more and more prevalent in and around us, I think, in the current environment. So just wanted to make sure I was highlighting those in terms of the areas that we have actually hit upon and dealt with previously. I think the one area that I do know that institutions are currently really, I think, starting to think about and ask questions about are really going to be in the Bylaw 12 space are relative to delayed enrollment.
We did have a couple questions wanting maybe a little bit more thought process on the ability of staff members, coaches, promoting their student athletes activities, fundraising for social causes, COVID-19 charities, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the question, and I really do think in many ways the framework that we're having conversations about and we're trying to get membership input on using our various channels, whether it be through the CCACA advisory, whether it be through NAC feedback, et cetera. I think to really kind of gauge our thought process, but it really is about I think trying to make sure that we're adhering to the idea of these truly being voluntary activities, meaning that the coaches are doing, they would be liking any of their kids' activities in this particular area, or they would be wanting to, another one of those areas is just to kind of make sure that it's being done, I think, in a way and then consistently with what your institution would be doing for any student who is engaging in these types of things and promoting those. And so I think there is some, I think there's some flexibility there. I do think it is kind of understanding that it shouldn't be as a methodology to hopefully, and especially when we're talking about athletic fundraisers, it shouldn't be used as a methodology to drive other athletes to be engaging in those types of things, or to be driving kind of you're liking it because of the performance of that activity and not for others, as opposed to everybody that engaged. You're liking it for the social activism that's involved. Steve, does that help with that response from the individual asked it?
Yeah, it does. I think the follow-up question is, obviously we've got a couple of issues front and center right now with the pandemic, with the social injustice issues and awareness activities. But when we get to other, do we have any guidance on other types of charitable activities, charitable promotions, like breast cancer awareness, for example? Assume the same analysis would apply in your thinking, Alex? Yeah,
I think I think it's hard to say how. I think we are certainly having those conversations in terms of how that will likely go into the broader conversation we are having regarding name, image, and likeness. And I think that's, again, why we're trying to make sure we're balancing not our guidance in this particular situation, in these particular situations that are front and center, with the ongoing conversations we're having in that NIL space. Now, I don't want to be predictive nor jump the education that may be going on in later in the summer, et cetera, as that gets more solidified. But my sense is that's why I think those generalized points of view have been ones that we're adhering to, but that is being done within the context of these couple of front and center situations. So I don't necessarily want to say run with that guidance in other areas, but I think it is being thought through in that broader NIL context.
Thank you.
Thank you. Like I was saying, I think the one area that we are continuing now to have, I think, additional conversations in the Bylaw 12 areas in relation to delayed enrollment and potential decisions regarding whether to enroll or not based on COVID-related decisions, whether there will be an ability to enroll or not. And I think we're trying to, we are having ongoing conversations. I think it is really from a framework of how I think we're originally looking through this and trying to better understand, you know, and to try and measure, you know, the gauge of the importance of enrolling and beginning one's clock versus the ability to continue to engage in you know, not be enrolled and engaged in your sport, and whether there's a potential benefit to that versus a student who does enroll. I do think that as we're looking through that, some of the gauge that we're looking at is to truly better understand the bylaw itself, and using some of that language that talks about the first opportunity to enroll. And really, I think as we work with the membership and we're trying to find potentially a functional means, whether that's through CARP and the Eligibility Center review process, or whether it's through waivers, is to try and see what is kind of outside of the control of the student athlete in terms of their ability to enroll at the institution in the fall versus what is in some ways maybe a choice that they are making in terms of delaying their enrollment, potentially because of roster changes or, you know, or those types of things, and trying to really, I think, manage and understand student athletes that truly don't have an opportunity to enroll in the fall due to things outside of their control. Bylaw 15. So I think a couple of things that we are, I think, continuing to get questions on, and areas that maybe we've dealt with previously. I think in the bylaw 15 space, I think I'm going to spend more time, I think, on a few of the areas that folks are asking us about currently, as opposed to just highlighting the Q&A as it exists currently. And certainly, if there's some things that people want to make sure I'm highlighting, you can certainly send them in, and I can do that. But a few of the things that we are currently, I think, seeing from the bylaw 15 for space is really relative to having lived through, you know, a semester where student athlete status as basically being on campus changed from being on campus to being at home. What are the things in terms of the potential for there being these reductions that would be in place going into 2021, especially I think as institutions are looking at their renewals, you know, with the July 1 deadline. One of the areas, because I think, again, not knowing whether institutions are truly going to be on campus, whether they're going to, anybody who is remote is going to be designated by the institution, like any other student, as being considered a commuter for purposes of their campus. There's the potential that if, you know, hey, I'm giving a room and board scholarship, what does that mean if ultimately now all students that choose to be at home are considered to be commuters, and therefore room and board is not an element anymore? I think what we've been advising folks, and in the same way that I think many aid agreements already have components in them that speak to if your status were to change, that the operation of your agreement would potentially change. Meaning that if I'm an out-of-state student and I'm going to provide full tuition, there's an understanding that if I move from being out of state to being in state, that my tuition by action of the agreement will be less. I think in the same way, I think by action of the agreement, I think you can speak to this idea of if your status were to change from being on campus and to being commuter, and therefore you as like any other student, your COA would be changed and that element would be eliminated. You would still be meeting the obligation of that agreement in terms of that. Now, you will, from that perspective, while there was from guidance from the federal government and Department of Ed, that with everything going on with COVID, there was not a need to necessarily go through the process of all students needing to have their cost of attendance adjusted in that context. My understanding is that these types of changes and these types of distinctions in the fall may very well need to be accounted for any student. So it would just be the need to not only adjust when you're doing the equivalency calculation, adjust the denominator, adjust the numerator, but in terms of meeting your obligation under the agreement, building in that piece, if you haven't already built it into your agreements, I think would be sufficient to say that that's not necessarily a reduction that requires a hearing opportunity. One of the other areas that we're seeing is what about how do we have to deal with say an international student who is on an aid agreement chooses to be or is unable to be able to get it to our institution, but is able to enroll virtually and therefore is considered a full-time student at our institution. And I think from that position, we would look at those individuals as being counters. We would look at all of the bylaws still being applicable to them, and then I think you really would have to work with your institution, to identify with that student what are they engaging with, and what is their ability to engage, and I think to the extent that they're able to engage in meetings, to still do their workout obligations, those types of things, to engage in similarly to how, say, somebody who would be on a rehab assignment would be engaging with a team. I think you need to be aware of that, I think, as you're looking at potential issues with their counter status, with other things relative to their agreement. Certainly, if the institution believes that they meet a means by which they may be able to reduce or cancel their agreement, we always make sure, again, they need to adhere to the fact that a hearing opportunity is required anytime that you're looking to reduce or cancel an aid agreement, and certainly would want to make sure that that is highlighted as part of that analysis. So certainly, now the question is, well, what about, would there be waivers available in terms of potentially being able to provide aid to somebody else who may be on campus and is able to, especially maybe in an in-season sport in the fall and those types of things? I think certainly the waiver process would be at least available from that. As we say with all waivers, it's hard to be predicted in terms of what the outcome of those waivers would be, but the waivers process certainly would be available, noting that situation.
Alex?
Yep.
On that point about international student athletes, we've got several questions that I think maybe go one more step and ask if the international student athlete either cannot travel due to bans either from their country to our country, or has some restrictions on taking online classes. What would the impact be on, financial aid, not only individually but against the team limits? And I think we also have a couple of questions related to even domestic student athletes who might find themselves in those situations where they cannot return to campus.
Yeah, I think I would highlight that question is to better understand, particularly and potentially, whether they are unable to be a student at your campus, meaning that they're not, because of their inability to travel, their inability to, that they are otherwise unable to travel, and thereby by potentially not even trigger counter status. I had taken my example one step further, which was a situation where they were unable to travel, but they were able to be considered a full-time student at your institution in the same way as other students would be able to engage with the institution virtually. Now, if your institution does not have a virtual option and therefore they're unable to enroll, I think then in the same way as someone else who's unable to, I think unable to enroll, they won't have triggered counter status because at that point, at least for the term. And certainly I think you have the ability to look and say, what is there potentially that they may have triggered something whereby you could cancel their aid as well, and do that analysis again with the hearing opportunity. But again, if you're trying to preserve their agreement for when they do return, say in the spring, that again that's managing individual opportunities and individual discussions.
The sort of follow-up question is, what relief is out there? Strikes me as you've sort of addressed that as the waiver process. I don't know if there's a blanket waiver in order or if we've gotten to that point yet, but several folks are asking about that as well.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things that I think we're in a constantly evolving environment in terms of understanding where institutions will or will not be 2 months from now, and where students may be, relative to their countries 2 months from now. So I think we are certainly in a constantly evolving conversation in here. I just wanted to maybe, like I said, just give you in the world we're currently living in, I think we would anticipate there may be some waivers, but I'm not sure how we'll evolve over the next 2 months in terms of how those will be ultimately addressed. All right, a couple other areas in terms of that. I think a couple areas that I wanted to highlight, and they go to the concept of with COVID-19 and potentially the impact on high school academic records, the abilities to take tests, collegiate academic records, et cetera, and the flexibility and or relief regarding honors exemptions. And I'm going to kind of answer this kind of twofold. One is to give a second question was, hey, where is 2019, 119 and all of this? And I think my latest understanding of 2019, 119 is that it is likely going to be discussed at the July 15th council meeting. I believe that July 15th is the appropriate date, but the July council meeting. And there is at least some push for it to not only be voted on, but to be voted on with an earlier effective date. I think primarily to assist with some of these, equivalency type situations and potentially open up more opportunities to have greater flexibility, I think, in the equivalency space. So just wanted to highlight that. I think relative to the conversations we've had on these exemptions, again, I think from our perspective, at least at this point, while we're still continuing to work with our eligibility center, I think as we're still trying to better understand what is predictive in this space, it's probably going to be something to where I think if you have individual waivers, I certainly think is this idea of what kind of will be our analytical framework. I think there are a couple of things and they're distinguishable. I think in the testing space, we have been working in terms of I had a test, I had one scheduled, I missed that opportunity, I was studying really hard. I think we have some data there that I think is going to be helpful in our analytical framework there, and we may see if we can identify a means by which to make that more able to be applied on campuses. So I think we'll certainly try and drill that data down and see if we're much as comfortable as we are with it. But if you, in the meantime, if you have a test situation and you're arguing that but for COVID they would have taken the test and they would have met certainly I think we can see that as a but for kind of analysis and do that analysis based on the data we have. Relative to the GPA, I think that becomes slightly more difficult depending on the scenario that is in front of us. I think if the scenario is, hey, this kid was knocking it out of the park, they were meeting all of the GPA obligation as of the end of the fall term, whether that be at the collegiate level or relative to their academic high school record, COVID hit, the world shattered, and they fell below. I think we have an academic record that we can look at and say, okay, but for COVID, and do that analysis. And I think in the waiver space and see what kind of a relief we're able to provide there. I think it's much more difficult to have a predictive model in the reverse, meaning that, and I think it would be very much upon the institution, I think, to make the argument that, but for COVID, this individual was on pace to either do as well or better than the fall or their previous academic record to get them to the GPA requirement. Now, I don't think that that is necessarily an argument that we would dismiss outright. We would certainly want an institution to put their best waiver forward and certainly look at it. But again, just being as we're looking at it and looking at what is the, understanding COVID and its impact, I think we still want to be able to say, okay, help us understand, but for COVID, what is the predictive model here? I think the last one, and I think it becomes a little bit more difficult, is going to be a recognition that in the COVID space, we may have situations where student athletes and their family implications in terms of their finances may have been hit remarkably, and that they are looking for means by which to find ways to assist with their educational efforts for their student, for their son and daughter. And they may look to avenues such as GoFundMe, such as reaching out to their church, those types of things. I do think in those instances, those are likely. I would encourage all of you that if you have situations where you believe that is likely going to be in play, that you are working with your student athletes so that they are coming to you, so that you can help them navigate those through potentially the waiver process. As we look to have those conversations, I think we are trying to manage, several different potential issues here. One is, and trying to better understand what are all of the other avenues other than potentially looking for fundraising as a means to assist with educational efforts. Secondly, I think trying to better understand, and offset the recognition that a booster by definition cannot create an athletic award or a scholarship that would go directly to a student athlete. So I think, again, there's an issue of trying to understand who may or may not be engaging in those types of efforts. So I think it's trying to understand how to navigate it, but I think at least recognizing that there may be those types of situations that may be arising. I think in the church kind of context, that's probably going to be much more basically having a better understanding of the history involved of what those individuals may or may not have done in the past relative to assisting other students on a basis unrelated to athletics as well. Steve, I see you up there. Did I wind up talking over a bunch of questions or some things that popped up as I was talking?
No, you're fine. And I think folks are generally really liking the information that you're sharing based on the chat. We had a couple, if I could step you back, one on 2019-119. I'll give them to you both and let you address. The first one was if the rationale that you laid out would apply to 2019 high school grads who may be in a gap year, a grace year, and still retaking exams or were scheduled to retake exams. So that was question one. Question two, I think, was simply on the effective date, which I understand is 2021. If you have an understanding of that will change at all moving forward, and maybe the timeline for when that proposal might be moved back into consideration.
Yeah, again, I think just to reiterate, I think my understanding to date, and that does not mean that that's what's going to happen. So I will start by giving you, I don't always, it's based on the best information I have as of right now, and please, if it does not happen, that way, they're always constantly evolving determinations here. My understanding is that the July council meeting that is the potential point at which 2019 119 would be pulled out and acted upon. And my sense is that if it is pulled out and acted upon, part of that discussion will be about potentially moving up its effective date to the August 1 of 2020 as opposed to August 1 of 2021. And then relative to those that are in the gap year, again, I think from the perspective of it, the argument is that they had it. I think it will be fact specific. Did they have a test that they were scheduled to take and then it was canceled? And again, I think looking at it, because again, they have that opportunity to increase their test. I believe through the bylaw, it doesn't require them, to have that locked in as a graduation. So I think with that ability to increase their test during that gap year, I think we would want to make sure though that they had been scheduled for one and that it was canceled, or they lost that factually, I think may be important in that analysis.
Yeah, another theme I'm seeing here, Alex, back on the international student-athlete issue, if they are able to come this fall, but are able to enroll in the spring, folks are interested in your thoughts about being able to extend aid to them for one term only, even if they don't meet an exception to the full year requirement.
Yeah, a couple of things here, and I will tell you that the way I would probably say as a way to look at it, if you've already renewed their aid for the year, you've met their 1 year requirement under that obligation, and therefore if they're not able to enroll in the fall, again, you're not providing them aid because they're not able to receive it because they're not a full-time student, but the agreement is in place, and therefore when they enroll in the spring, you can just honor the second half of that agreement for the portion of period of time that they are otherwise enrolled. I mean, so there's that. I think there's that opportunity. I don't think you need to go through necessarily through that process. If you truly understand that they are unable to enroll, as opposed to, I know of several institutions are potentially moving to an opportunity that their students may enroll physically, may enroll virtually. There may be many different ways by which they're considered to be full-time enrolled for and be part of the institution and therefore able to receive aid. Is that helpful?
Yeah. One other theme in the 15 space, and apologize if you've addressed this as I'm reading the questions here, but a couple folks have asked about relief, not for 2021, but in additional years for those student athletes who've gotten the season of competition waiver. So not this year's seniors, but freshmen, sophomores, juniors, if there'd be any relief to team equivalency limits, or is that something coaches will need to pay attention to in their recruiting process?
So I'm going to give the world as it exists currently, and then the never say never world. How about that? It's the easy way to respond here. The relief that was provided was only for 2020-21 for those individuals who exhausted or would have exhausted in the spring in 1920. That is the relief that exists. That is the group of individuals to where that relief has been applicable. So with that in mind, you can see the vacuum that is there. There was not action for years beyond that. Now, what that may be as conversations occur down the road, I don't have a good crystal ball on that, but as it exists currently, if you were to say, if I absolutely have to know and act on what the rule is going to be based on this moment, we should be going back to the regular application of bylaws in that financial aid space for 2021, 2022. But that conversation potentially is still ongoing and would probably be something that I think institutions and conferences and and the governance structure, you know, may have additional conversations as this continues to evolve.
Okay, let me let you get to bylaw 16.
All right, sounds good. So moving to bylaw 16 and trying to advance the slides so that you know I'm changing my thought pattern here for a second. I think there are a few things in bylaw 16 that we are really trying to pay attention to, and I think it is trying to manage a couple of things. I do think that in the Q&A and the first part of that Q&A in the bylaw 16 area that was designed in the moment, I mean, when everything was happening in the spring and has been kind of reassessed as we have moved into the summer, as we've moved into some other areas, is this idea of, as an institution, you are in a very good position to be, and in probably the best position to make determinations about health, safety, well-being relative to your students and your student athletes. And so I think there's some flexibility that's been built into that. I think there's some specific scenarios that were put forward in that area that were about, you know, hey, we have a kid who can't go home. Can we house them? You know, we had no intention of putting them on aid, but they need a place to stay. They need food. I mean, those are the kinds of things where, like, act in the moment. You can make a true health, safety, and well-being issue in those particular areas. I think as we've moved to this idea of, you know, voluntary activities on campus and bringing kids back who, you know, would have otherwise never left, and being able to provide them their you know, their room and board, even if they're not enrolled, because they had lease obligations or those types of things, and we talked through the health and safety there. You know, there's a lot of, I think, those individualized analyses, I think, that can be played. I think the questions that we are getting now, and I'm going to preface this with saying, I don't have a definitive answer. I just know that it's conversation to where we're saying, how far does that 16 guidance push in the context of, hey, we know that there are protocols that are likely going to be in place from our state, you know, that need to be adhered to, our locality that need to be adhered to, and we want to potentially provide room and board expenses relative to before the start of summer access, before the start of preseason. The question may wind up being relative to before the start of classes, and then the ability to engage in out-of-season athletically related activity for particular sports. And I think as we're analyzing that, I think we're trying to make sure that we understand what the health safety component is there, understanding that as we've had conversations with our, you know, our CSMAS and some other medical personnel, and are trying to understand whether, you know, as the ability to get up to speed in the, you know, in the summer access and the preseason, whether it's the ability to get back what we lost. I think as that's the primary argument of wanting to be able to engage in those things as soon as possible from a get back what we lost perspective. I think we're at least having some conversation to better understand, would we extend that. I think there are other scenarios, though, that I think where we're a little bit more comfortable if the argument is, no, hey, we want to bring some groups of athletes back to our campus maybe a week or 2 weeks early, because they're going to be the one population that we know is going to be traveling. Is there a population that we, because of their unique circumstances, they help us to serve as a microcosm of what we want to do for students generally. I think also if there's some sense that, hey, if a student wants to engage in these types of activities and go through the protocols early, we or another group of students, we would be paying for their opening up dorms early, opening up food service early, we would be doing that for those as well. It's an ongoing conversation. I don't mean to say that I understand where it's going to come out particularly. I just know that there's at least a little bit of a weighing there in terms of truly understanding the health, safety, and well-being concern in those particular contexts. So that is one of the areas that we're having some questions. I think another area that we're having some questions is the unique situation here relative to summer access, especially in the sport of football, where there's a recognition that there is not a need for enrollment this year. And so the question that is invariably coming out of that is, can we support all of our athletes, including all of our incoming student athletes who are engaging in summer access under 1652, and do we have to worry about potentially the impact of 1519 and 1 in terms of since there is no need for summer school? I think the answer there is if all you're doing is providing room and board expenses under 1652 under these unique circumstances for this year, you won't have provided any summer aid in that particular instance, at least from an NCAA perspective, because they're not needed to be, nor are they enrolled. However, if they are otherwise, otherwise enrolled, I think you need to be aware of if you're then providing them aid, financial aid to, for the tuition portion of that, then you may run into potential 15191 issues there. But we are trying to, we understand that it's a unique situation this year where there is not a requirement to be enrolled for those engaging in summer access. And because of that, with those benefits only coming from 1652, that's the only implication is the 1652. So I think that's some of the major areas. I did get at least one question on the front end, which was, hey, as we, and I've gotten several questions that I think we put in the Q&A relative to, can we relief from the 50% rule, potentially the ability to provide student athletes with, an hour where they're the only ones potentially dining. I do think that I would wind up wanting to point you to, in those areas, really kind of what is the institutional plan and what is the institutional logic, not at the direction of athletics, but if there is institutional logic behind this in terms of, hey, again, we are protecting the rest of our student population because our student athletes have travel protocols, so therefore, we want them to be able to access the dining facility, for 30 minutes before, maybe even in the same way we would allow for access for maybe somebody who was, may have underlying medical conditions or those types of things. That there are a list of non-athletically related reasons, and I think there, again, travel components would be, we would argue, your amount of time off campus may wind up being, I think would certainly be something that, as we look at it, we would say that appears to be, driven not by a benefit that's being driven because of their student athlete specific status, but really relative to give some flexibility for the institution to implement protocols that they believe are for the benefit of the student body writ large.
Yeah, I've got one in 16 and one in 12 that were interesting. The 16 question appears to be specific to basketball for international student athletes who cannot fly out of their country to come back to the U.S. for summer access when that starts next month. If they're going to, quote unquote, country hop, get to another country where they can fly out of to the U.S. The question is around expenses. In particular, it appears that from the question, maybe some club coaches are arranging expenses. So that was an interesting question on 16.
Yeah, I think that's one that I would probably suggest that we have not heard, and that would be a good one that we'll make sure that we have some ongoing conversation about that. I think certainly it is one to where I think one can make an argument that in that particular situation, if we were talking about actual unnecessary expenses, one could potentially make that argument. I just am hesitant to give a yes or a no without at least a little bit of additional conversation, just to see if there are particular nuances that maybe I'm not paying attention to, and trying to make sure we give it some real thought. But I do think that's one that is new to me, and certainly one I think we can certainly add to our list of ongoing questions and answers.
Yeah, and the follow-up is going to be because summer acts are starting up here in a few weeks, that we'll need to try to make that a time-sensitive reply or issue.
Yeah, I do want to make the follow-up though, and certainly as I'm thinking through the level of conversation there, just if that country has an inability to fly, you may want to make sure that you're tracking appropriately whether that country is then in at all providing appropriate visas for their citizens to travel out of the country as well. And you may have other issues you're not thinking about that may prevent even the scenario you're talking about.
Okay. Back to Bylaw 12. And the question was generally around the cancellation, or I guess postponement, of the Olympic Games later this summer. If student athletes receive training expenses for the Olympics, but those training opportunities did not happen due to COVID-19, are there amateurism issues that institutions should be aware of?
I think from a legislative perspective, I mean, the answer is that it's supposed to be an appropriate offset. Now, I think what I would say is under those circumstances, it may be helpful to understand whether the national governing body itself, recognizing that, has potentially created an avenue whereby they're not providing any additional expenses this year, and so meaning that the check that was designed to cover expenses for last year has in effect been replaced something that they would have, so I think it would be helpful to understand the facts there, whether those individuals are continuing to receive other training expenses, or whether the national governing body, recognizing that they've in essence prepaid training expenses for upcoming months, and then maybe we can find some flexibility in trying to say, okay, can we find appropriate offsets to be you doing such from a practical perspective? So again, I think ultimately additional conversation there, but I think it would be helpful for maybe them to better understand what's the ramifications of the postponement relative to what those individuals are receiving for the 2021 academic year in preparation.
Okay. One more interesting one in Bylaw 12, specific to the extension of eligibility waiver, and the question is whether or not that applies to a student athlete who did not participate in a spring sport but would like to participate in a spring sport. For example, would they be able to get a 6th year on their clock to play golf when they've not previously played golf?
Yeah, I'm going to punt that one to our student athlete reinstatement folks, and I said reach out to them. My understanding again is this is ultimately for those individuals that I think were in some year at their institution engaging with the spring team in 1920. So I think from that perspective, if they were not looking to engage in that spring sport in 1920, and I think there would be some practical implications. There may not be the ability from a self-application perspective, but I think SAR would probably at least help them run through their normal waiver process and at least give them some indication of how that normal waiver process may or may not work itself out. But I think they're the better experts in terms of being able to speak to either the season of competition waiver or the extension of eligibility waiver. I did want to thank you all. I do appreciate everybody's time. Again, we will wind up taking and trying to do a cut and paste of the full chat so that we can use that as a blueprint either to help develop the Q&A, work with CCACA, NAC, et cetera, to find the appropriate way to get information out to the membership, and or if it is such a very nuanced question relative to you as a institution, we may be reaching back out to you to ask you to put it into our SRO or to give you a response directly. But again, appreciate everybody's engagement. From what I hear from Steve, the chat function was moving fairly fast and furious. I know this is not the easiest way to conduct a Q&A, but I appreciate everybody's willingness to engage with us in a way that I think is helpful and helpful dialogue in the space and in the time we have. Appreciate everyone's time, appreciate all of you, and again, have a great day, have a great weekend, and be safe and be sane, and thank you.